Most of us look at this plant and see exactly one thing, a pretty purple, faintly sleepy smell. It goes in candles and it goes in lotion. Maybe it is the thing your grandmother grew along the front walk because it kept the bugs away and made the porch smell nice on a summer evening. But here's a question that changes everything. What if I told you that this exact same plant was standard issue medical supply in field hospitals during the First World War? That growing it and using it to treat your neighbors could 400 years ago get you formally accused of witchcraft, and that right now today, there is a version of it sitting in pharmacies across Europe and the United States that has been tested in randomized clinical trials against actual prescription anxiety medication and held its own. This is the real documented history of lavender. It is a story of a flower that mainstream medicine relied on completely discarded and is now suddenly rediscovering under a microscope. Let us start at the beginning, with a problem nobody has ever fully settled. Nobody can even agree on where its name comes from. For generations, the standard story has been that lavender comes from the Latin word lavare, meaning to wash. And the Romans genuinely did use it. That way, they tossed lavender into bathwater to perfume. It scented their bed sheets and clothing with it. And by the time of the historian Pliny, the elder lavender flowers were a real luxury good. A pound of it reportedly cost about a month's wages for a farm laborer, so people were not growing this for fun. That to wash story gets repeated by lavender farms and herbalists constantly. Here is the part that rarely gets mentioned. A lot of historical linguists are not actually convinced it is true. Some etymologists trace the name instead to the Latin lividus, meaning bluish or livid, describing the color of the flower, not what anyone did with it. Even the Romans themselves apparently could not settle on one name. The Greeks called the plant nardus after a Syrian trading city. Some Romans called it osserum, supposedly because they believe venomous aspi vipers like to nest underneath it. So even the most basic fact about lavender, its own name has quietly been argued over for 2,000 years. That is a pretty good clue that a lot of what we think we know about lavender is actually just folklore passed off as fact. And the disagreements do not stop with linguists, as royal courts across Europe could not even agree on what lavender was for. In Tudor and Renaissance, England washerwomen were literally nicknamed lavenders because they spread laundry over lavender bushes to dry, letting the scent soak into the fabric. Queen Elizabeth I reportedly drank lavender tea for her frequent headaches. A century later, France Louis XIV was said to favor bathing in water, scented with it echoing the Romans more than 1,000 years earlier. Same plant, different centuries, different countries, same instinct. This is useful for something. Nobody, it seems, could quite agree on what laundry freshener, headache remedy, royal indulgence, or all three at once. That confusion is harmless when you're talking about bathwater and bed sheets. It gets a lot less harmless once you get to what happened to lavender and the women who used it during the Middle Ages. Here is where the story turns dark, and it is mostly true though, not quite the way it usually gets told. Throughout medieval Europe, ordinary women were often the only health care a village had. Universities trained male physicians for the wealthy. Everyone else relied on local healers, midwives, and wise women who passed down herbal knowledge for generations. Lavender included used for headaches, cleaning wounds, and calming nerves. For centuries, this was simply tolerated. Then starting in the late 1300s and intensifying through the witch trials of roughly 1450 to 1750, something shifted. As the church and the new university-trained medical establishment consolidated control over what counted as real medicine, independent female healers increasingly found themselves accused of witchcraft. Tens of thousands of people, the overwhelming majority of them, women, were tried across Europe and eventually colonial America, Salem included. For a long time, the popular story was that powerful men deliberately targeted these women to monopolize medicine. But the real history is actually a lot messier than a clean conspiracy. Most people caught up in the witch trials were not even healers. They were just ordinary villagers caught in local feuds and panic. Midwives and herbalists absolutely were among the persecuted, but they were not specifically singled out as a class, and there is no evidence of a coordinated plot by physicians. The reality was driven by fear, religion, and power struggles, and traditional plant knowledge just got caught in the crossfire. Either way, the end result was exactly the same. Across huge stretches of Europe, herbal medicine went underground for centuries. The plants did not stop working as people just stopped being allowed to talk about them as medicine in public without risking their lives. Now, there is one legend from this era you have probably heard of because it puts lavender right in the middle of Europe's biggest disaster, the Black Plague. The story goes like this: during a plague outbreak in France, a group of thieves kept robbing the homes and graves of plague victims, yet somehow never got sick. When they were finally caught, the magistrates offered them a lighter sentence in exchange for their secret. Their answer, a vinegar steeped with a handful of aromatic herbs, usually some combination of sage, rosemary, thyme, garlic, and lavender, rubbed on the skin and breathed through cloth masks before entering infected homes. Historians are genuinely skeptical the exact event ever happened. One researcher traced the popular version of the tale to the 1800s, centuries after it supposedly occurred, stitched together from older, vaguer plague folklore. But the herbs themselves were not randomly chosen. We now know fleas. The actual carriers of plague are repelled by several of those same aromatic compounds, and lab testing has confirmed that herbs like sage, rosemary, and lavender do have measurable antimicrobial activity. So, Four Thieves vinegar is probably legend dressed up as history, but legend built on a real working principle. Lavender was a supporting character in that story for centuries before it ever got its own headline moment. That headline moment arrived in 1910, and it started with an explosion. On July 25, 1910, a French chemist named René Maurice Gadafosse was working in his laboratory. His family was in the perfume business when a flask of distilled essence exploded. Boiling liquid covered his head and both hands. By his own account, the burns were severe enough that gas gangrene, a fast-moving, genuinely life-threatening tissue infection, started setting in almost immediately. What he reached for next is the detail that made him famous. He rinsed the burned skin with lavender essence. According to his own later writing, that rinse stopped the infection from spreading, and healing began the following day. Over the decades, the popular retelling has gotten more dramatic, with each pass sometimes turned into an instant miracle, zero, scarring story that historians who have gone back to his original 1937 writings say is somewhat embellished. But the core of it holds up. It was a severe burn, there was a terrifying risk of infection, and the recovery was actual historical fact. It convinced a trained chemist to spend the rest of his career studying essential oils, and he is the person who coined the word aromatherapy. Gadafosse did not stop at his own hands. World War I broke out a few years later, and French military hospitals were desperate conventional antiseptics, and supplies were running short, and infection was killing staggering numbers of soldiers in the trenches, often from wounds that should have been survivable. Gadafosse and his collaborators developed a formula combining deterphenated lavender and rosemary oil that laboratory testing showed could kill Staphylococcus bacteria on contact. Hospitals in France and elsewhere began using it. But here's the wildest part. Gadafosse did not even patent the formula. He believed it should be available to anyone who needed it and gave the manufacturing process away for free. That same war took his younger brother, who died of an infection in 1918, a reminder of exactly how high the stakes were and how limited the available medicine actually was. By the time the next World War arrived, a new generation of French military doctors picked up where he left off. Jean Valnet was a French army surgeon during World War II, and later in the brutal fighting in Indochina, where medical supply lines frequently could not keep pace with the wounded. Operating in conditions where conventional antiseptics and antibiotics were scarce or simply unavailable, Valnet turned to distilled essential oils lavender, among them to dress wounds and fight off the secondary infections that in that era killed as many soldiers as their original injuries. He kept detailed records of what worked. After the war, he spent decades turning those battlefield observations into something closer to a real clinical discipline, developing a testing method his colleagues called the aromatogram, designed to measure in a lab how well a given essential oil actually inhibited bacterial growth, rather than relying on folklore. His 1964 book on the subject is still considered the foundation of modern French clinical aromatherapy, which is part of why to this day French pharmacists are trained to be familiar with essential oils in a way most American pharmacists simply are not. So, by the mid-20th century, Lavender had accumulated some pretty heavy-duty medical credentials, ancient bathhouse perfume, a plant tangled up in witch trial era, persecution, plague era, folk remedy, battlefield, antiseptic, across 2 world wars. And then within a couple of decades, it nearly vanished from medicine entirely. Why did this plant disappear from modern medical practice? Now, this is usually where people start screaming conspiracy, like the medical establishment buried it to protect big pharma. But the truth is actually way simpler and honestly kind of fascinating. Lavender was not suppressed, it simply got outcompeted. Around the same years Valnet was treating soldiers in the jungle, penicillin was being mass-produced for the first time after researchers figured out how to scale up Alexander Fleming's earlier discovery in time for World War II. A standardized lab-made antibiotic that could be dosed precisely manufactured in massive batches and proven through clinical trials to reliably kill specific bacteria was for treating a serious infection simply a better tool than a plant extract whose strength varies with harvest soil and distillation method. Doctors did not abandon lavender because of a backroom deal. They abandoned it because something measurably stronger and more consistent had just arrived, and hospital medicine reasonably reorganized around what worked best. Herbal remedies did not get erased so much as quietly demoted from the treatment to the thing people used before we had a treatment. Nobody buried it, it just got beat by something better, and medicine moved on. And that is not the end of Lavender's story. Here is the part that might genuinely surprise you. In just the last few years, lavender has been appearing in serious scientific journals, not as folklore, but as a subject of real laboratory research. In Petri dish studies, the 2 main compounds in lavender oil, linalool and linaloyl acetate, have been shown to physically damage the outer membrane of several bacteria, including strains of E. coli and staph, causing their internal contents to leak and disrupting the cell energy-producing machinery. Researchers have also found that lavender oil can interfere with bacterial biofilms, the slimy protective shields that make certain infections especially stubborn to treat with standard antibiotics. That is genuinely interesting science, part of a larger serious search for new tools against drug-resistant bacteria. But look, let us be real for a second, because we are talking about petri dishes here using crazy high concentrations you would never put on your skin. None of it means lavender oil is a substitute for seeing a doctor about a real wound or infection, and no major hospital or health authority treats it as one. What it does mean is that lavender antibacterial reputation, from Roman bathhouses to plague-era folklore to battlefield medicine, was not pure superstition. There is a real measurable chemical mechanism underneath it, even if it is nowhere close to replacing modern antibiotics. Where the modern science actually gets impressive is not about infections at all, it is about anxiety. So here is the funny twist. The whole battlefield wound healing thing turns out to be mostly outclassed by modern antibiotics. But the old Roman idea that lavender calms your nerves is the part that actually blew away expectations when researchers put it to the test. Take Silexin, for example. It is a specific standardized lavender oil capsule. And this stuff was not just tested by wellness bloggers, it went through gold standard randomized clinical trials for generalized anxiety disorder. The exact same rigorous testing they use for prescription drugs. In head-to-head trials, Silexin performed comparably to actual prescription medications, including the anti-anxiety drug lorazepam and the antidepressant paroxetine, with measurably fewer side effects. It is now sold over the counter in more than a dozen countries, including the United States, and researchers are currently running trials to see whether it can help with PTSD symptoms as well. It has even shown up in mainstream hospitals. Several studies on pre-surgery anxiety have found that simply having patients smell lavender in the minutes before an operation measurably lowers their reported stress, which is part of why you will occasionally find lavender-scented aromatherapy used in pre-op waiting rooms today. Not as medicine exactly, but as a low-cost, low-risk way to help people calm down before something stressful. So, what does 2,000 years of this history mean for the bottle of lavender oil sitting in your bathroom cabinet? It means it is a genuinely reasonable tool for exactly the things the modern research backs up: calming a racing mind before bed, taking the edge off everyday stress through a diffuser or a pillow spray, or soothing very minor unbroken skin, irritation, a small bug bite, a mild sunburn, once it is properly diluted in a carrier oil rather than applied straight from the bottle. It is not a tool for deep cuts, serious burns, or anything that looks infected. Those situations need a doctor, full stop. Even the most impressive lab results do not change that. And if you are considering using it around babies while pregnant or with young children, it is worth a quick conversation with a doctor first. Because let us face it, concentrated essential oils are incredibly potent even if they did come out of the ground. Used that way as a genuinely well-studied complement, not a replacement for actual medicine, lavender earns its reputation honestly. So, the next time you walk past a lavender bush or light a lavender candle, it is worth remembering everything that purple flower has actually been through. It perfumed Roman bathwater, expensive enough to be a status symbol. It got tangled up in some of the darkest persecution in European history. It rode along with thieves robbing plague victims, sat in the kits of battlefield surgeons across 2 world wars, lost its place to penicillin, and is now sitting in a pharmacy capsule that has been tested head-to-head against real prescription drugs. There is no grand cover-up here. It is just what happens when you actually dig into the history instead of believing what is printed on a candle box. And it turns out the real story never needed any exaggeration at all.